week. So 1 Samuel chapter 11, and there are probably a lot of ways in which you can title this chapter, but I sort of look at this as Saul proving himself. In light of what happens at the end of chapter 10, 1 Samuel chapter 11 is really about how Saul will prove himself, essentially silence the critics that are mentioned in verse 27 of chapter 10. Of course, part of this is going to not just prove Saul as a person, but this is also in part Saul trying to prove himself to be the adequate person to be the king of Israel. Verses 1 through 3, we're sort of presented with the occasion that begins Saul in his task to prove himself to be king. Verses 1 through 3, again, we are introduced to the problem. Let's begin in verse 1. The text says, Then Nahash the Ammonite came up and encamped against Jabesh Gilead. And all the men of Jabesh said unto Nahash, Make a covenant with us, and we will serve thee. So the word then in 1 Samuel chapter 11 and verse 1, what that indicates to us is we've got another change of scenery, we might could say. 1 Samuel chapters 9 and 10, we're introduced to Saul and essentially how Saul meets Samuel. Saul becomes, or is at least anointed king, and it's declared in front of the people, and all of that sort of one picture, we might could say, in a book, or a one chapter in a book. And it's almost like we're turning, literally into another chapter, or turning another page in the book to a new story that helps illustrate why, again, Saul's going to become king. Right? The word then is sort of the idea. We always want to keep in mind when we're thinking about this chapter what has just happened, especially in verse 27 of chapter 10. After Saul is declared to be king, verse 27, there are children of Belial, or worthless children of destruction, that said this about Saul, How shall this man save us? And it says that they despised him and brought him no presents, but Saul held his peace, or did not retaliate against them. And so Saul has critics. Even though he's publicly been proclaimed to be king, Saul has his critics based on verse 27, at least people that argue that he cannot save the people of Israel. So what's going to happen in chapter 11 is essentially Saul's going to save the people of Israel, to silence them. We note, of course, we think about this as a principle. Sometimes this happens, right? We see other instances in the Bible where people have doubt. And in order to remove that doubt, they have to be convinced based on some physical action. I can't remember if it was this past week or one of the Bible classes or sermons where Brother Wayne brought out about Thomas, right? After Jesus dies, he appears to his disciples. Thomas is not there. He really doesn't believe that Jesus is resurrected. And Thomas simply makes the request again that, can I put my hand into the side of Jesus? And that way all doubt will be removed that I know that he was resurrected. And of course we could think about in that moment, Jesus of course could have criticized him for a lack of faith. The disciples of Jesus could have, and the apostles could have criticized Thomas for a lack of faith, but Jesus decides to give enough evidence by appearing, and Thomas is going to be able to put his hand in his side. And then he knows. Well, likewise, even though maybe this lack of faith in Saul is unjustified based on what we talked about last week with how God has approved of this selection, God's not just going to settle with that. There's going to be an occasion for Saul to prove himself, right, despite the unjustified doubt that people have in him. And that's where we come to verse 1. We read about a man named Nahash the Ammonite who is essentially coming up and wants to battle and take over the city of Jabesh Gilead. Now, when it comes to Nahash, we don't know a whole lot about him. In chapter 12, verse 12, we discover that Nahash is actually a king of the people of Ammon. It's referred to in chapter 12, verse 12. Samuel's going to reiterate that point again. If you go to 2 Samuel chapter 10, verses 1 and 2, you read about how David treats the son of Nahash rather fairly. And it said that the son of Nahash becomes king, so more than likely Nahash is the king of Ammon. Might have been a different Nahash in 2 Samuel chapter 10, but nevertheless is probably talking about here a king of Ammon, right? The nation of Ammon was located east of Palestine, really into the desert. And so if you're thinking about this on a map, if you get a map in your Bible, it might help you to look at it. But Ammon would have been on the eastern side of Palestine. So you think about the Jordan River, you know it's located on the eastern side of Palestine. You're within that general area, what's being laid out here in verse 1. Again, this is Nahash who's come up against the city of Jabesh-Gilead. The men of Jabesh-Gilead, just a reference to the elders of the city or the leaders of the city. And what we have indicated by this is that Nahash was apparently a pretty powerful military figure, because the men of Jabesh-Gilead don't even try to fight. Maybe that's because they see the number of men and they like their own strength, but they do not try to fight. And so their response to this is that we just simply need to make a covenant with these people. We need to essentially make an agreement that we're not going to attack them and really try to appease the Ammonites from attacking us. We don't want them to come against us, which turns out to not be that great of a decision based on what we'll see in verse 2. You keep in mind that in Exodus chapter 34, verses 11 and 12, God had given specific directions to Moses and to the children of Israel in the wilderness of, in the Sinai Peninsula, or around Mount Sinai, in that area as they're wandering, or as they're on their way to the Promised Land, and later on we'll begin the wandering. But Exodus chapter 34, verses 11 and 12, God said this about the idea of making covenants with other nations. Observe thou that which I command thee this day. Behold, I drive out before thee the Amorite, the Canaanite, the Hittite, the Perizzite, the Hivite, and the Jebusite. Take heed to thyself, lest thou make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land whither thou goest, lest it be for a snare in the midst of thee. And specifically, the point being here is, again, that the land of Canaan, you had a lot of these idolatrous nations. If you make a covenant with them, you're basically going to allow them to live among you. You tolerate them, and it's not going to work in your favor. Well, we keep that in mind in 1 Samuel chapter 11. You know, making a covenant with these people, really not in the best interest of the Israelites if they want to remain pure and holy. I think about this example a lot when I think about, making a bad treaty, a peace treaty. Some of you may be familiar with this story, but during the late 1930s, the Prime Minister of Britain, Neville Chamberlain, like many other people in the West, were a little bit concerned about Hitler and how quickly he rose to power and his military aggression towards other nations around them. And one of the things that Neville Chamberlain's, at least his idea about how to settle the matter, was to essentially appease Hitler, to get him to sign a treaty saying that he won't invade, I believe it was Czechoslovakia, or at the time it was Czechoslovakia. And he goes and he goes and meets with Hitler. He gets the agreement that Hitler says he's not going to invade Czechoslovakia. And Neville Chamberlain takes pride in this. He gets back to Britain. He gets off the train. And it's reported that he says, "We have peace in our time." And it wasn't about 2 to 3 weeks later that Hitler actually invaded Czechoslovakia, because he was trying to appease the wrong person, because Hitler obviously wanted that territory. Nahash is going to want the territory, essentially, either that, and we'll sort of get an indication of that in verse 2. Verse 2, Nahash the Ammonite answered them, "On this condition will I make a covenant with you, that I may thrust out all your right eyes and lay it for a reproach upon Israel." So one thing that's revealed probably in verse 2 is sort of the state of how well Israel is defended at this point. The city itself is trying to negotiate a peace treaty, probably because there is no unifying government here. There's no unifying presence. Again, this is the period of the judges where God had to raise up the leader. And God at this point has not raised up a military leader. And so the people are having to essentially try to formulate a peace treaty on their own. And so really they're in a position of weakness. And this makes sense why Saul is going to prove himself, because at this point the people of Israel are really dependent. They don't have much hope in terms of deliverance. And so Nahash responds, and what we see in verse 2 is essentially that, their own weakness. They recognize that if we make a treaty with Nahash, maybe we can get protection from him. That was, again, verse 1. They make the covenant. They promise to serve Nahash, or to pay tribute, to pay money, to work for the king in order for their protection. That's how, what we might think, at least in their mind, how defenseless they saw themselves. But, verse 2, there's a very steep condition that the people of Israel must make if they want to have Nahash's protection. Nahash wants them that with this covenant, the condition is that I may thrust out all your right eyes and lay it for a reproach upon Israel. There are traditions that are recorded for us that Nahash troubled a lot of the people in that area. And you can probably find excerpts of that on the internet, but there are traditions where Nahash apparently posed a lot of problems to these people. And the condition is, again, the cutting out of the right eye. And you keep in mind that with covenants, a sacrifice was often made with a covenant, right? With the covenant, the law of Moses, you had the animal sacrifices. With the introduction of the law of Christ, the new covenant, the sacrifice was Christ himself. But even in some of these other religions around them, there was the understanding that if you make a covenant, some type of sacrifice had to be made. And generally it was an animal sacrifice. But you note here that that is not what Nahash wants. Again, the word covenant literally means to cut. Instead of literally cutting an animal open, right, to get the blood out, the importance of sacrifice, he wants the eye, the right eye of the Israelites, of these men of Jabesh-Gilead, to be cut out. And the right eye, sort of like the right hand, was seen as the dominant eye. Zechariah chapter 11, verse 17, in that passage, Zechariah is talking about what will happen to idol shepherds, or shepherds that are idolatrous, they're not working hard. And Zechariah talks a lot about the coming of Christ. But he talks about that one of the things that will happen to them is that they would have their right eye cut out. And that's important because it was sort of seen as a great damage to a person, but also a great insult. And this is not just for the men of Jabesh-Gilead, it is a reproach upon all Israel. When you think about what this means, is that Jabesh-Gilead is going to do this, and it's going to be a sign to the rest of Israel, in the sense that Nahash wants the rest of Israel to be afraid, just like the men of Jabesh-Gilead are. And that were the terms of the condition if they wanted peace. And we think about how this could apply to us. Now, obviously, we don't have people coming and telling us that, you're going to lose your house, you're going to lose your home, and the only way you can stop that is, you got to cut out your own right eye. We don't have that problem, but when you think about it, the Israelites are faced with the problem of essentially making a covenant with sin. And, what would potentially lead to sin? Idolatry. You think about that for us as Christians, sometimes it's very tempting. Maybe we're struggling with something in life. Maybe maybe that's an illness. Maybe that's, conditions in the home. Maybe that's economic issues. Very easy for us to try to make a covenant with sin to overcome that problem that we're dealing with, as though it will temporarily sort of get us out of the sticky situation that we're in. Sort of what the men of Jabesh-Gilead feel, right? Make a covenant. Even if it introduces a possibility for sin, we can make that covenant for our own security. Well, a lot of times, sometimes we might do that as Christians. It may be easier for us to try to make a covenant, make an agreement with sin in order to get out of difficult situations. But like what Nahash's terms of the condition were, they're very painful. They're very painful. Same way with sin. We might make a covenant with sin, but we don't necessarily recognize all the conditions that come with making that covenant, the punishment that comes, what is required to meet the conditions of that covenant, because sin pays a steep price. Romans 6:23, the wages of sin is death. Likewise, we can sort of look at it in that sense. We can't make a covenant with those that are wicked because the conditions, the price for that covenant is something that we shouldn't be willing to pay because of what it does in terms of our relationship with God. So verse 3, the elders of Jabesh Gilead, they recognize the conditions and they say, "Give us 7 days respite that we may send messengers unto all the coast of Israel, and then if there be no man to save us, we will come out to thee." So give us 7 days. Now, you might think, why would Nahash agree to this? Doesn't make sense. Within 7 days, maybe the people of Israel can gather up enough men to be able to fight the armies of the Ammonites that are coming in. But really, if you think about what Nahash is trying to do, he's trying to send a warning message to Israel, and it really shows his confidence in his ability to defeat the Israelites because, again, these are people that are not unified. Otherwise, Jabesh Gilead doesn't have to make a covenant agreement with them because they don't have a standing army. We might could think about this like in the sense of, say, if we don't have a federal government with a national military, an army, a navy, the Marine Corps, the Air Force, and all that. Say we don't have all that. We're just a group of loosely independent states, and say, for instance, that Mexico wants to invade Texas and to take Texas and claim it as their own. Well, Texas on its own probably doesn't have the resources to fight, to be able to defend itself. Maybe because of the separation of all the other states, they don't have the ability to come and to help Texas. And so there's a certain need of unity to have maybe a person at the top that can sort of direct things. And this is really what Israel's lacking. And that's how Saul's going to step in and essentially save the day for the people of Jabesh Gilead. So 7 days they're going to go. Really 7 days is going to be adequate time for the people of Israel to hear what has happened. Because this is not just one messenger that's going out, but you've probably got a good bit of messengers that are going out to all parts of Israel to deliver this message. And essentially they're going out and saying, this is our last option. This is our only hope, is if we can have one man, or at least a group of people, come and help fight for us. If that doesn't happen, then verse 3, we will come out to thee, or we agree to the conditions of the covenant. So that's verses 1 through 3. That's the occasion. Verses 4 through 9, now we see the messengers going out, and we're going to see Saul's response in that. Verse 4, the messengers, they're going out everywhere, but we read that they come to Gibeah of Saul, which is again Saul's birthplace, and told the tidings in the ears of the people, and all the people lifted up their voices and wept. It's estimated that from Jabesh Gilead to Gibeah of Saul would have been about 42 miles. And when you look at the book of Judges, there's an indication that these two cities might have had close connections with one another based on their past. When you keep in mind that the Benjaminites were attacked in Judges 21 because of the wicked deeds of some of the men of Benjamin, the men of Jabesh Gilead did not go up to fight against Benjamin, unlike the rest of the children of Israel. At the same time, the men of Benjamin, later on in the book, a lot of them got their wives from the city of Jabesh Gilead. So maybe there's some familial connections between the two cities. So if anybody was, the idea is if you're in Jabesh Gilead and you want somebody to come to your aid, if you've got a lot of extended family that lives in another city, it's probably a good idea to go to them and ask for their help because they're more likely to help you out, which is going to indeed be the case. Verse 4, the people are sad about the news. All the people lifted up their voices and wept. And again, this indicates that these are people that are concerned. It's not like they're indifferent to what's going on in Jabesh Gilead. They're concerned about what's going on, but they don't know how they're going to solve this problem. Verse 5, enter in Saul. And behold, Saul came after the herd out of the field, and Saul said, What aileth thee, the people, that they weep? And they told him the tidings of the men of Jabesh. And the Spirit of God came upon Saul when he heard those tidings, and his anger was kindled greatly. Again, we've mentioned verse 5 before because, again, Saul's been proclaimed as king, but yet here he is going out and working in the field. Which is, again, sort of shows that Saul, he wasn't afraid of hard labor. A lot of people, maybe if they've been declared king, they might think to themselves that it's time to kick back and make other people do things for me. And I can sort of be lazy and just sort of sit around because I've been proclaimed as king. Well, Saul doesn't take that mindset. He's out working in the field. The word there for herd, in some translations translate that to oxen. And what probably was going on is that Saul's out plowing in the field with oxen. And this is obviously a tough job to do. I don't know a lot about farming, but I know plowing a field can take a lot of effort, and not having all that modern day technology, not an easy job to have. But yet here's Saul doing all those things when he hears about what's happened in Jabesh Gilead. Verse 6, it says that Saul becomes angry, that the Spirit of God came upon him. Now we note in the last chapter that for Saul, the Spirit of God came upon him. He started prophesying, and he was able to speak. He was able to prophesy with the prophets that came. But you do see other occasions in the Old Testament, especially in the book of Judges, where it sort of denotes the Spirit of God coming upon somebody. And it may be similar to what's given in Judges chapter 3, verse 10, when Othniel becomes the first judge of Israel. Verse 10, the Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and he judged Israel and went out to war. And the Lord delivered Chushan-Rishathaim, king of Mesopotamia, into his hand, and his hand prevailed against Chushan-Rishathaim. So the Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and he judged Israel and went out to war. Whereas the other people are weeping and maybe are afraid of what's happening, what's indicated verse 6 is that now Saul has the courage. His anger is kindled. He has the courage to go and fight against the children of Ammon who've come against the city. So in that way, first of all, Saul proves himself. He's not responding like, say, what's happened in chapter 10, where he's hiding from the people because maybe he's afraid of being in front of them. At this point in chapter 11, he's one of the only ones that so angry, so provoked that he wants to go and fight against the Ammonites. Again, shows his transformation, his courage. So he does something interesting, verse 7. At least maybe interesting for us. Verse 7, he took a yoke of oxen and hewed them in pieces and sent them throughout all the coast of Israel by the hands of messengers, saying, Whosoever cometh not forth after Saul and after Samuel, so shall it be done unto his oxen. And the fear of the Lord fell on the people, and they came out with one consent. I've referenced already this occasion before, but the occasion in the book of Judges that provoked the Israelites attacking the people of Benjamin, the men of Benjamin had essentially defiled one of the servants and killed one of the servants of a Israelite that was traveling in the area. And the Israelite took the body of his servant and cut the servant up into pieces because she's already dead, and sent the body parts throughout all of Israel. And what that meant was it was essentially a call to war. Well, Saul kind of does the same thing here in verse 7. He takes a yoke of oxen, he hews it in pieces, he cuts it up, and then sends it throughout all the coast of Israel, throughout all the tribes of Israel. And essentially Saul is calling for the men of Israel to gather to go to battle against the Ammonites, which what's given here is he's the only one that does this. The messengers of Israel have gone throughout all of Israel, but it's Saul in Gibeah that decides to call the Israelites together to go to war against the Ammonites. He's going to step in and be the leader of the people of Israel. Note that he does not do this just on his authority, but he does it on the authority of Samuel. Again, Samuel, he's a spokesman of God. Saul is ordained as the king because of Samuel. And so the idea again is that, this is what God wants. The fear of the Lord fell upon the people. They came with one consent. Or out of their respect for Saul and Samuel, Saul, who again is God's anointed, they come and they support their king. Verses 8 and 9, Saul counts the people. They come up and they send a message to the men of Jabesh Gilead. Verses 8 and 9, and when he numbered them in Bezek, the children of Israel were 300,000, and the men of Judah 30,000. And they came, and they said unto the messengers that came, Thus shall ye say unto the men of Jabesh Gilead, Tomorrow by that time the sun be hot, ye shall have help. And the messengers came and showed it to the men of Jabesh, and they were glad. So verse 8, you've got a large number of people that have gathered, 330,000. 300 from Israel, 300,000 from Israel, 30,000 from Judah. Again, Judah, probably one of the larger tribes, maybe one of the more important tribes, which maybe is why they are listed separate. But you've got a pretty formidable fighting force to go up against the Ammonites, which that message gets relayed to Jabesh Gilead, and the message is, by that time the sun be hot, ye shall have help. And the men of Jabesh Gilead would be glad. It's kind of looking up to figure out about, what did it meant by the time the sun be hot. But again, the idea was that it was, there were, I believe, 3 watches. I'm trying to pull this up in my notes. There were supposedly in the spring and fall there were 3 night watches. And so this watch that's being talked about here was somewhere around from 2 a.m. to 6 a.m. Again, the Jewish day began at 6 a.m. So you're talking about they're right there in the early morning when they're planning this attack. And Jabesh Gilead, if they had made that covenant with Nahash the Ammonite, they may very well not have had the defense of the people of Israel to help them out. And again, we can make that application for us. We think about how if we give in, if we form a covenant with sin, we not only cut ourselves off from God, we cut ourselves off from the people of God. And so the people that can help us out with the problem of sin, we cut them off from helping us out. I emphasize this a lot at the end of my preaching about, when we fall into sin, we have the opportunity to have people pray for the forgiveness of our sins, right? People that are righteous. James chapter 5 talks about that. The effectual, fervent prayer of a righteous man availeth much. But if I live in a lifestyle of sin and I cut myself off from the people of God, I lose the connection to have with that person who can help pray for the forgiveness of my sins, especially if they're public in nature, because I've made a covenant with wickedness. Well, same thing here. If the men of Israel, the men of Jabesh Gilead had made a covenant with the people of Nahash and given in to the immorality and paid the price, they not only paid the price, but they had cut themselves off from the people of God, who were really the only people that could save them and to be their ultimate defense, through relying on the help of God. So maybe that gives us something to think about in light of that. With that being said, are there any comments that you'd like to add on to what we've already discussed in verses 1 through 9?
If they'd given in to Nahash, you get the idea. I just sort of assumed that I doubt that he would stop with taking the right eye out. The next thing to come along, we're going to go with your left eye, then your right ear. Sort of like with sin, once you give in one time, it sort of snowballs, and that could have very well been if they'd given in to him. He just kept making demands.
Yeah. And if you, on the live stream, you weren't able to hear that point Brother Wayne was bringing out, is that sometimes when you try to appease a harsh ruler like this, sometimes that harsh ruler winds up wanting more later on. So you give up your right eye now, maybe it's your left eye a month from now, or your arm a year from now, or something like that. But fortunately, the men of Jabesh Gilead do not do that. Pick up in verse 10, verses 10 through 11. Therefore the men of Jabesh said, Tomorrow we will come out unto you, and you shall do with us all that seemeth good unto you. And it was so on the morrow that Saul put the people in 3 companies, and they came in the midst of the host in the morning watch, and slew the Ammonites until the heat of the day. And it came to pass that they which remained were scattered, so that 2 of them were not left together. So it appears, though, that the men of Jabesh Gilead were going to go out maybe they were trying to give the appearance that they were going out and sort of surrendering themselves to the Ammonites. But verse 11, we see that Saul has divided the men up into 3 companies. And obviously, you think about military strategy, you can sort of try to, attack on different sides. It's maybe a more effective way of fighting. And it turns out to be that way. Verse 11, the Ammonites are killed under the heat of day. They're from 6 a.m. into the afternoon, and they're so much destroyed or defeated that 2 of them were not left together. They are completely scattered. They are, what the Old Testament a lot of the time says, they are discomfited, utterly confused. They are utterly defeated. And so all of this story from verses 1 through 11, all of this account, should say, is showing how Saul proved himself to be king. Again, he's the captain of the people of Israel. And he has just demonstrated that and essentially has shut up those in 1 Samuel 10, verse 27, that question, how could Saul save the people of Israel? Well, by verse 11 of chapter 11, Saul has done that very thing. He has saved not just Jabesh-Gilead, but the Ammonites, who could have increasingly moved into Israelite territory. So we close tonight with the last section, verses 12 through 15. Now, verse 12, the people said unto Samuel, Who is he that said, Shall Saul reign over us? Bring the men that we may put them to death. And you think that this might be a natural reaction, because these men had obviously insulted Saul. Saul had proven himself, and so really they had offended Saul by their questioning. Again, Saul's the rightful king of Israel. And so these people naturally think that, their just punishment is to be put to death because they have doubted God's anointed. And as great as everything that was in verses 1 through 11, this is really where Saul's character stands out in this section, because you would think that Saul would naturally be inclined to put them to death as well because they have insulted him. They themselves could be viewed as traitors to a certain extent because they don't have their full support of the king. But verse 13, Saul said, There shall not a man be put to death this day, for today the Lord hath wrought salvation in Israel. Saul's response is that, in part, if you put these men to death, you're taking away from how great this day was. Right? Because all of Israel has been saved. Even those men that doubted my authority, they have been saved as well. This is a day of rejoicing, not a day to put to death people of the children of Israel, because they have been saved. And you sort of see Saul's mercy in this. One of the finest moments in the life of Saul, because Saul, a lot of times people stumble when they're victorious. They get the big head. Saul does not do that at all. He extends mercy towards those that had doubted him. It's a really good example for us about, how we extend mercy towards others, to have that same mindset. Saul as king probably could have argued for a justifiable right to put these men to death, but he rather decided to show mercy towards his opponents. Likewise, we think about how the mercy, we talked about this a little bit in the parables, the mercy, how much mercy God has bestowed on us. Especially, think about the parable, the wicked servant, or the servant who wouldn't forgive the man of a lesser debt because he didn't want to extend mercy. Well, Saul extends mercy, and it's to his credit. We as Christians need to be a people that extend mercy even to people that do us wrong, because we can gain a lot of we can change a lot of enemies, turn them into our friends, and we turn a lot of people into our friends by extending mercy to them. That's exactly what Saul does here. Unifying the people. Verse 14, Then said Samuel to the people, Come and let us go to Gilgal and renew the kingdom there. And all the people went to Gilgal, and there they made Saul king before the Lord in Gilgal, and there they sacrificed sacrifices of peace offerings before the Lord. And there Saul and all the men of Israel rejoiced greatly. So unlike the end of chapter 10, everyone now is in agreement that Saul is the king of Israel. And at this point, Saul begins to act, takes the position of being king of Israel because he has proven himself based on what happened in chapter 11. And that is where we will draw to a close tonight. Are there any comments that you'd like to add on to chapter 11?
Well, it goes back to that principle we talked about, doing right when you've been done wrong. That's exactly what Saul did, the right thing, even though he'd been done wrong.
Absolutely. Doing the right thing when we've been done wrong. Absolutely, yeah. That's a really good point, too. You know, Saul, that's a good point. A really good point to bring out. I didn't think about that right offhand. But you do know verse 13 that Saul does not take credit for the victory. He gives God the credit for the victory, which again I think shows his mindset towards his position when it came to God and his position in light of men. A very good point. Saul gave God the credit in the victory. Well, that being said, we'll go ahead and stop here. We'll pick up in chapter 12 next week. We'll return to Samuel talking to Israel once again. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention this evening.